This is the Reading Instruction Show. I'm your host, Dr. Andy Johnson. Topic of today's podcast is Context Matters, Letters, Science of Reading Research Standards, and Baloney. This is a series of 7 short YouTube videos looking at each of these areas. And this one will look just at number 1, using crises. Using crisis. There have always been people willing to use crisis or the illusion of crisis for personal benefit. And that is the same with reading. The National Assessment of Educational Progress is part of the U.S. Department of Education. They collect scores on students aged 9, 13, and 17 every 2 years in math, reading, and other subjects. And they can break them down by states, and you can compare one state to another. But what you can't do is randomly determine causality. You can't say Wisconsin is better than Montana because Wisconsin does this and Montana doesn't do that. You can't say scores have risen or fallen because of this or because of that. You cannot, in a scientific world, and if you're a science of reading person, you don't randomly determine causality. There are far too many variables involved. There simply is no irrefutable evidence that we are experiencing a national literacy crisis. Scores, they started collecting them in 1971, have stayed relatively stable, maybe rising slightly. A crisis would look something like that, but it does not. It looks something like that. Scores have been relatively stable since 1971. This is to 2020. And look it up yourself. NAEP data, U.S. Department of Education. You can get scores for reading, math, and other things. Look it up yourself. Now, NAEP has 4 categories: advanced, proficient, basic, and below basic, of scores on these tests, on these reading achievement tests. But these categories, levels, and content, they are arbitrarily defined. That's what you need to know. On a norm reference test, they compare the scores to a normal population, and you get that nice bell-shaped curve. And in a normal population, 50% are going to be below the mean or the mean average. That's called normal. If 50% of your school is scoring below average, that's called normal. This is the NAEP basic level, proficient, and advanced. So you see, absolutely, you should have students below basic. Below basic. Now, states tend to have criterion reference tests. That's different than a norm reference test. This establishes a criterion that must be met at each grade level. But it's an arbitrarily defined set of criteria given each year, saying that 3rd graders should know this, 4th graders should know that. Somebody arbitrarily decided that. But who? Who decides the criteria? Who decides the categories and levels within each category? Who decides the content of a criterion reference tests? I can tell you what they did in Minnesota. Minnesota Comprehensive Assessment Exams. They took the 3-dimensional core content state standards, the benchmark standards, and these are standards, these tell what students should know or be able to do, and they converted them into 2-dimensional criterion reference tests. They took the 3-dimensional core content state standards, benchmark standards, and converted them into 2-dimensional criterion reference tests. Now think about this. Criterion reference tests. These are the criterion, they said. These are what 3rd graders should know or be able to do. How often in your adult life have you had to do any of these? And why do 3rd graders need to know this? Distinguish among literary elements. It's interesting. It could be part of a curriculum. But why is it important to define their literacy potential based on this? Who decided that third graders needed to be able to do these things? Are these a means to an end or an end in it of itself? If so, what is the end for third graders? Now in Minnesota, no test scores are reported when they say test scores are falling. Instead, percentages are given in 4 arbitrarily defined categories. And again, these are arbitrarily defined categories. Arbitrarily defined content on the criterion reference tests. Telling percentages that are at or above proficiency is not a comparison of scores over time, but that's what they do here in Minnesota. Students take statewide reading assessments in grades 3 through 8 and 10, and you see 49.9 met or exceeded grade level standards, down 1.2 percentages. Okay, that doesn't really tell us anything. You can't compare students in one grade to students in another and say things are going down because they're two different populations. Reading is creating meaning with print. It is not sounding out words. That is the end state. We read for 2 purposes: to understand information and to enjoy good books. That's the end state. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the objectives or the baby steps that lead to this end state? The second thing they do is create an enemy. You have to have an enemy to fight against. And I would posit that those people that think Ken Goodman, Lucy Calkins, or Marie Clay are so horrible have never actually read any of their work. Read their work, then tell me, what is it with which you disagree? Read their work. If you're going to be against something, you should know something about that which you're against. You shouldn't be against Lucy Calkins just because people tell you you should. What is it exactly with which you disagree? These are eminent scholars. In the context of a crisis, simplistic solutions are offered. If you would just use my phonics program, if they would just teach more phonics, if they would just do science of reading, all the problems would go away. If they would just use letters professional development and pay Lexia Learning thousands and millions of dollars, then our students will be reading. Well, let me tell you, in 5 years, you're going to find out that all the money you spent is wasted. And then, in the context of a crisis, they bully, they silence, they threaten those who disagree. If you can't win the argument in an academic setting, you pressure lawmakers to pass laws to force compliance. You bully and threaten those who disagree. Now, meaning-based reading instructors, we've already won the argument in an academic environment. In an academic environment, research is used. Research is the currency used in an academic economy. But if you can't win the argument there, which the skills-based cannot, then you have to bully and threaten and try to eliminate those who disagree. I've got plenty of online trolls. That's fine. Teachers are afraid to speak out. They're afraid of losing their job. That is not good education. I'm threatened. My program is threatened if I teach the wrong thing in my classes. That's not right. Lucy Calkins is part of a lawsuit, for goodness sakes. How absolutely stupid is that? That's like saying, my kid didn't pass algebra, I'm going to sue the publishing company. Absolutely absurd. By the way, this whole thing of reading wars, there never was a reading war. There was a coup by profiteers and politicians eager for money, power, and control. There never was any reading war. That was a term made up by people outside of literacy. There's always going to be healthy disagreements, this healthy creative tension that's important to keep us evolving. But a reading war, that's people outside of literacy. And in the context of a crisis, you mandate reforms and you eliminate choices. Teachers don't have choices. You have to do this. Or they give the illusion of choice here in Minnesota. You have one of 3 professional development things that you can do, but that is not a choice. And they don't trust you to think. They don't want you to think. We'll do the thinking for you. You just shut up and follow the manual. And we're going to come around and we're going to look at you, and you better have that manual in your lap, and you better be doing it with fidelity. We're going to check on you. That's what they're saying. This is the end of part 1.